Alrighty, welcome back to Modern Josephus. I am going to go ahead and do another crash course here. I know it's been a while since I've done it, but I had some teaching to do and things. So I was a little busy for a few months there. But hopefully this summer we can get to it. I know in a couple of days is the Battle of Philippi, and I do intend on getting that done, going over that. I think they have a video. I'm not sure. I should probably check on that. But anyway, we'll get to that. We'll cross that bridge when we get there in 2 days. Anyway, today we'll go ahead and do the natives and the English on Crash Course U.S. History number 3. Without further ado, I will go ahead and push play.
Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course U.S. History, and today we're going to talk about one of the worst relationships in American history. No, thought bubble, not my college girlfriend and me. Mr. Green, your relationship with your high school girlfriend? Oh, the past. You and I both know that I didn't have a high school girlfriend. No, I'm talking about the relationship between Native Americans and English settlers. So as you'll no doubt remember from last week, the first English settlers came to the Chesapeake area, now Virginia, in 1607. The land the English found was, of course, already inhabited by Indian tribes unified under the leadership of Chief Wahunsonica, and I will remind you that mispronouncing things is my thing. The English called this chief Powhatan, because, of course, mispronouncing things was also their thing. Powhatan was actually his title and the name of his tribe, but to say that the English lacked cultural sensitivity would be an understatement. So Powhatan didn't get to be the leader of over 30 tribes by being a dummy, and he quickly realized that, one, the English were pretty clueless when it came to not dying of starvation, and two, they were useful because they had guns. So he decided to help them, and the English were indeed grateful. In fact, colony leader John Smith went so far as to order the colonists to stop stealing food from the Indians. Oh, in the book business, this is known as foreshadowing. So as previously noted, relationships, whether between individuals or collectives, tend to go well when they are mutually beneficial. And for a while, both the English and the Indians were better off for these interactions. I mean, post-smallpox. The Virginia Company existed to make money, and since the Chesapeake lacked gold or silver, making money required trade. Okay, let's go to the thought bubble. We tend to think of trade between Europeans and natives as being a one-way exchange, like savvy, exploitative Europeans tricking primitive, pure indigenous people into unfair deals, but that isn't quite accurate. Both sides traded goods that they had in surplus for those they did not. The English were happy to give up iron utensils, tools, guns, woven cloth, in exchange for furs and, especially in the early days, food, which the Indians could easily part with because they had plenty. Soon, though, there were problems. In order to keep up trade relations, Indian men devoted more time to hunting and less to agriculture, which upset...
I'm glad that he actually mentioned that. I guess that shows he sometimes has a balanced history so far on what we've seen. The English weren't trying to take advantage of the Indians or the Native Americans at the very beginning. There were cases later where they did, and I don't know if in the next, or maybe even in this video, they'll talk about the relationship between the Pilgrims and the Native Americans, but I'll go ahead and go forward. If I don't see him talk about the Pilgrims and the Native Americans, I'll add to that. But we'll go ahead and keep this going.
Set traditional gender balance in their society, and European ideas about land use started to overcome traditional Indian ways of life, and that led to conflict. The English liked to fence in some of their land, which kept the Indians off it, and also the English let their pigs and cattle roam freely, and the animals would eat natives' crops. And as Europeans' appetite for furs grew, Indian tribes began to fight with each other over access to the best hunting grounds, leading to intertribal warfare, which suddenly included guns. But this was still a
Okay, so I don't know if he's acting like this fight between the Native Americans over furs and things like that was just because the English were there. To me, here's the thing, and I think I've said this in videos before. Before the English came, we don't know much about Native Americans. They didn't really keep any records at all. So the fight for furs may have been going on years before any English settlers arrived, and hunting grounds were a big thing for Native Americans. So to say that just because the settlers arrived, all English settlers arrived all of a sudden, and they wanted um, access to furs, that all of a sudden this created a problem. No, I mean the Indians, the Native Americans, that's all they were using were furs. That's what their life depended on. And if he doesn't talk about it with the Pilgrims and the Native Americans with Chief Massasoit and things, I will talk about it myself because there's a lot to be discussed about that in relation to furs and territory between of Native Americans. But we'll just keep this going.
Relatively calm time. Yes, at one point John Smith was captured by the Indians and had to be saved by Powhatan's daughter Pocahontas, but this was probably all a ritual planned by Powhatan to demonstrate his dominance over the English. Pocahontas never married John Smith, by the way, but she was kidnapped by the English and held for ransom in 1613, and
doesn't that make you just hate Disney? Every time I've seen that too. So I've seen the Pocahontas from Disney, and I've also seen there was another movie which sadly I own. I thought was going to be very good and all this about, the Jamestown, and I thought that they'd be accurate in this, but I guess I should probably rent movies first before I buy them. That way I make sure I'm getting the deal, the right content I'm looking for. But man, every single time I see Pocahontas and John Smith having this romantic relationship, it's like very cringe worthy, if I can say that. And as a historian, I just cringe all the time. When I watched those, I was cringing. It was just really ridiculous. Don't these movie makers, read a little bit before they make these movies? And that movie that I saw, I think it's called The New World. And toward the end, they bring in John Rolfe, and he marries Pocahontas, and great and wonderful. But why did they had John Smith, having this thing? But anyway, I mean, she was only like 11 at the time, and he was like 35 or older, something like that. So anyway.
And she did eventually marry another Englishman, John Rolfe. She converted to Christianity and went to England, where she became a sensation and died of disease. Stupid disease.
She actually met the Queen of England and was treated, or was in the royal courts and things like that. So.
Always deciding the course of human history. Anyway, despite not marrying Pocahontas, John Smith is still important to this story because when he left Virginia for England after being injured in a gunpowder explosion, things between the Native Americans and the English immediately began to deteriorate. How? Well, the English went back to stealing Indians' crops and also began stealing their lives via massacres. Thanks, Thought Bubble. Man, you guys sure know how to end on a downer, although to be fair, there are not a lot of uppers in this story. So after a period of peace following Pocahontas' marriage to John Rolfe in 1614, dramatized here, things finally came to a head in 1622 when Chief Opechancanough led a rebellion against the English. It had become abundantly clear that more and more English were going to show up, and they weren't just there to trade, they wanted to take Indian land. But the English struck back, as empires will, and the uprising of 1622 ultimately failed. And after another failed uprising in 1644, the 2,000 remaining Native Americans were forced to sign a treaty that consigned them to reservations in the West. Well, the West.
2,000 Native Americans? I'm pretty sure there were probably more than 2,000 Native Americans. You're just talking about the 2,000 Native Americans of Powhatan's tribe. And that's one thing I always have a problem with this history is they act like all other Native Americans were not involved or were not there. I don't know really much about the Virginia thing. I have a book that talks about it, but I have yet to read it. And I don't know. They might get to the Pilgrims and Massasoit eventually. We have a lot of time here, so probably. But you can especially see in the whole Massasoit thing, I mean, there's Indians joining the English to fight against other, Native American tribes. So, just by saying, oh, there's only 2,000 Native Americans left. No, there's only 2,000 left of Powhatan's tribe. All right. There's a lot of other tribes there. that do not participate with Powhatan and are not part of Powhatan's tribe.
West of Virginia, at least. But the 1622 uprising was the final nail in the coffin of the Virginia Company, which was a failure in every way. It never turned a profit, and despite sponsoring 6,000 colonists, by 1644, when Virginia became a royal colony, only 1,200 of those people were still alive, proving...
Well, set up your town in a swamp, and it's not going to go very good.
Once again, that governments are better at governing than corporations. Up in New England, you'll recall that the Pilgrims probably wouldn't have survived their first winter without help from the Native Americans, which of course led to the first Thanksgiving and then centuries of mutually beneficial trade and generosity. Just kidding. While some of the Puritans who settled in New England, notably Roger Williams, tried to treat the Indians fairly, in general, it was very similar to what we saw in the Chesapeake. Settlers thought Native Americans could be replaced because they weren't properly using the land. Now, John Winthrop, who you'll remember from last week, at least realized that it was better to buy land from Indians than just take it. But Puritan land purchases usually came with strings attached, the main string being that the Native Americans had to submit to English authority. Now, the Puritans had a rather conflicted view of the Indians. On the one hand, they saw natives as heathens in need of salvation, as evidenced by the Massachusetts seal, which features an Indian saying, "Come over and help us." On the other hand, they recognized that the Native American way of life, with its relative abundance and equality, especially when it came to women, might be tempting to some people who might want to go native. This was such a concern that in 1642, the Massachusetts General Court...
All right, I have read several history books on the subject of Puritans and Pilgrims and Roger Williams. I don't know if he's going to mention this, but I think it's very important to mention, and that is that to distinguish, I guess, between these different English factions. The Pilgrims were basically separatists who were leaving their native country to come over to the New World, mainly because they were fleeing religious persecution. A lot of them were being imprisoned, and hefty fines were placed on them just for meeting in secret. They had to meet in secret in order to practice what they believed the Bible wanted for them to do. Then you had the Puritans, and the Puritans were more attached to the Anglican Church. They wanted to reform it, kind of like a Martin Luther type deal, but they didn't want to separate from the Anglican Church. They just wanted a few changes. So actually, the Pilgrims and the Puritans were two totally different things, and they actually were totally different colonies. And the first generation really didn't get along with each other, as far as, Puritan Massachusetts Bay and the Pilgrims down in Plymouth. It wasn't until the second generation that they started to bond more. But the Puritans still saw the Puritans saw the Pilgrims as more radical in their belief. But then you had Roger Williams and the Baptists, and they were seen as even more radical than even the Pilgrims. So that's why they all had different systems. But I like what he said about Roger Williams. I just read a book on Roger Williams and Plymouth Plantation. I think it's actually called Plymouth Plantation. I should start bringing my books and kind of showing you guys what I've read. But it was a very good book, and it showed how Roger Williams tried his best to defend the Indians and defend their homeland and defend their territories from the Puritans. But again, the Puritans were not going after every single Native American tribe. They would ally with other Native American tribes in the area. And I hope he mentions it, but he's kind of slipping it, so maybe I'll have to just discuss that at the end.
Court prescribed a sentence of 3 years hard labor for anyone who left the colony and went to live with the indigenous people. There was even anti-India propaganda in the form of books, captivity narratives, in which Europeans recounted their desire to return to Christian society after living with the Indians, were quite popular, even though some, like the famous Sovereignty and Goodness of God by Mary Rowlandson, did admit that the Indians often treated their European captives quite well. New England's native population...
Okay, so about the Mary Rowland, he says they treated their captives very well. Okay, here's the deal with Mary Rowland. First, they went and killed her whole family, and then they took her captive and treated her well. but he didn't mention that.
Lacked an overarching leader like Powhatan, but by 1637, the inevitable conflict between the English and the Indians did happen. It was called the Pequot War. After some Pequots killed an English fur trader, soldiers from Massachusetts, the newly formed colony of Connecticut, and some Narragansett Indians who saw an opportunity to gain an upper hand over the Pequots attacked a Pequot village at Mystic, burning it and massacring over 500 people. The war continued for a few months after this, but to call it a...
And Roger Williams was against that. He made his voice known against that. But it is true that they went in and took out the Pequots. Interesting thing, and I'm glad he just mentioned that 2 Englishmen killed some Native Americans, but there a couple of Native Americans, but there's a whole backstory to it. And this is where, it's the English's version against the Native American version. The English version is that these 2 Pequots basically killed an English settler in cold blood. The Native Americans version is that this man came to was trying to cheat them out of land, or had just taken some land from them, something to that effect. And so they just tried to get their land back. He refused, so they killed him. And of course, so you have these 2 conflicting versions, and to really know which one is true, you don't know, because it's 2 Native Americans, 1 guy who's dead, 1 word against the other, and you can't really know. And in some of these situations, sometimes we'll just say, oh yeah, it was the Native Americans, and the other side of historians will say, oh no, it couldn't have been the Native Americans. For me, I like to take a neutral position and say, I don't know. It could be either or. Now, to add to the Pequot War, maybe he'll mention it, but to add to it, if you look around and you see that ring, the outer ring there, who do you see? Native Americans with bows and arrows. So apparently some Native Americans allied with the Puritans to take out the Pequots. There's a reason for that. Those Native Americans assisting the Puritans also wanted land. And so they would ally themselves with the Puritans in order to take out another Native American tribe that they had been fighting with long before the English had gotten there.
A war isn't a way to give it too much credit. The Indians were overmatched from the beginning, and by the end, almost all of them had been massacred or sold into slavery in the Caribbean. The war opened up the Connecticut River to further settlement. It also showed that Native Americans...
And I won't take that away from what he said. It is true that those Puritans murdered and sold into slavery whoever was remaining, and that is true. And Roger Williams railed against that, and that's a sad part of that time period. But I mean, who can blame them? The Puritans were not very good people. They whipped one English Baptist, almost to death till his shoes were overflowing with blood. And then in another instance, they hanged like 30 Quakers, all for religious purposes. So yeah, Puritans are not very nice people.
Americans were going to have a tough time resisting because they were outnumbered and they had inferior weapons. But the brutality of the massacre in Mystic shocked even some Puritans, like William Bradford, who wrote, "It was a fearful sight to see them frying in the fire."
Okay, so he says William Bradford is a Puritan. William Bradford was not a Puritan. He was a Pilgrim. And his colony, Plymouth, was different from Massachusetts Bay, controlled by Puritans. Man, for a crash course in history, it's really missing some context here.
But despite the odds, New England natives continued to resist the English. In 1675, Native Americans launched their biggest attack on New England colonists in what would come to be known as King Philip's War. It was led by a Wampanoag chief named Metacom, which is why it is also sometimes called Metacom's War. The English called Metacom King Philip due to their fantastic cultural sensitivity. The conflict was marked by brutality on both sides, and it
was probably because if I remember right, I think Philip was actually baptized. His father, Massasoit, who had a great relationship with the Pilgrims, of course, I think had him baptized. And he was christianed, as they would call it, Philip.
ended English settlements in the Northeast. The fighting itself lasted 2 years. Indians attacked half of the 90 towns the English had founded, and 12 of those towns were destroyed. About 1,000 of the 52,000 Europeans and 3,000 of the 20,000 Indians involved died in the war. As I mentioned before, the war was particularly brutal. The Battle of the Great Swamp was really just a massacre of Indians by the English, and when King Philip was finally killed ending the war, his decapitated head was placed on a stake in the Plymouth town square, where it remained for decades. And on the other side, well, to quote Nathaniel Saltonstall, who lived through the war, the heathen rarely gave quarter to those that they take, but if they were women, they first forced them to satisfy their filthy lusts and then murdered them. Saltonstall went on to describe a particularly brutal way that natives would kill colonists' cows, by cutting their bellies and letting them go several days, trailing their guts after them. That indigenous people would reserve such brutality for livestock says something really important about this war. The Indians correctly saw European colonization as a threat to their way of life, and that included the animals who trampled Indians' land and whose grazing patterns required the English to take more and more territory. Some of the stories told about Native American brutality also suggest the symbolic nature of this war, like one English colonist was disemboweled and had a Bible stuck in his body cavity. Supposedly, the natives who buried him explained, "You English, since you came into this country, have grown exceedingly above the ground. Let us see how well you grow when planted into the ground." But it wasn't just the Indians who felt their way of life being threatened. It's time for this week's mystery document. The rules here are simple. I read the mystery document, I try to guess its author. If I'm right, I don't get shocked with the shock pen. If I'm wrong, I do. The righteous God hath heightened our calamity and given commission to the barbarous heathen to rise up against us and to become a smart rod and a severe scourge to us in burning and depopulating several hopeful plantations, murdering many of our people of all sorts.
It's scourge, not scourge, but okay.
And seeming as it were to cast us off, hereby speaking aloud to us to search and try out our ways and turn again unto the Lord our God, from whom we have departed with a great backsliding. Okay, I don't know this one, so I'm going to have to piece it together. We have a plural narrator. That's important. Seemingly monotheistic, feels like the heathens, in this context likely the Native Americans, have been sent as a scourge, or scourge, as it is apparently properly pronounced.
You got it.
But I'm from Alabama. I don't know how to say a ton of words. I mean, I just recently learned that you don't check your Yahoo mail, you check your Yahoo mail. And Yahoo's over already. Right, so plural narrator, scourge, great backsliding. Stan, you're going to get to shock me this time. Who is this? The laws of war passed by the General Court of Massachusetts in 1675. Are you kidding? From now on, the mystery document must always be written by a single human person.
Yes.
I hate this so much. Worse now, because I've had it before, so now it's going to... This shows us the way the Puritans understand the world, but it also shows us that within 50 years of its founding, Puritans already felt that the mission of their colony to be a great Christian community was already kind of a failure. If they'd been as righteous as they were supposed to be, God wouldn't have sent the Indians to burn their homes and kill them. So it's important to understand that this was a war to preserve a way of life for both the Indians and the English. And that brings us to another question. What's the point of even telling these bloody stories about massacres and atrocities? One point is to remind ourselves that much of what we learn about American history, like all history, has been cleaned up to conform to our mythological view of ourselves. Native Americans have been so successfully marginalized.
Okay, so here's the thing. He says it's been cleaned up, but then I've already pointed out several points where he hasn't really been balanced. So he's trying to get rid of one theory and replace it, or one way of interpreting this history, to another way to interpreting history. And that's my problem. I like to see balance. Now, I will say this, well, before I continue on. The Puritans, the way they acted, not just toward Indians or Native Americans, but also how they acted toward... sorry, I say Indians a lot. I grew up saying Indians, but I do want to check myself, and I will say Native Americans. All right, Indians are from India, and that's all because Christopher Columbus got all confused. So, the Puritans calling people barbarous and heathen. I mean, come on, Puritans. You guys hung a whole bunch of Quakers, whipped one Baptist until blood was running out of his shoe. And you're going to talk about barbarous heathens? All right, so that's one point there that we got to clarify. Another thing is this. So, very interesting is that uh, King Philip's War, it wasn't just a war between the English. And this time, the Puritans and the Pilgrims both got together in this war, mainly because it was, and by this time, William Bradford, I believe, had been deceased. His son, though, was in charge. And I'm getting this all this information is from a book I read called Mayflower by Nathaniel Philbrick. He's a very famous historian, written several books. You can go to Barnes and Noble, and they'll, all his books are on the shelf. And I have several of them. So, a very renowned historian. And from what he wrote in his book, is that it wasn't just English versus King Philip. There were at least one other Native American tribe called the Mohegan, and based on James Fenimore Cooper's Last of the Mohicans. And these Mohegans, they joined the English, and they joined because it was a coalition. It was a coalition between Connecticut, Plymouth, and Massachusetts Bay against not just King Philip, actually. It was also against Rhode Island and the Narragansetts there in Rhode Island. And they all three got together, or all four, if you include the Mohegan, to get King Philip, to defeat King Philip. And I will say that their excuse for fighting against what they were doing to King Philip and how they were purchasing land was very, what is the word I'm looking for? It was not fair in how they were trying to purchase, which is what irritated Philip. It wasn't that the English were buying his land, is that they were unfairly buying his people's land. And that's what ticked them off. That's what launched the war. And so I won't defend the English at all. And I will say that if King, again, we have to balance this. If King Philip is right that they were cheating him out of their land, then he had all the right to fight against the English. All the right. And even if the English, though, were purchasing fairly the land and he attacked them anyway, then maybe we can talk about that. Because that's just attacking, people who have no protection and have no idea that you're getting mad. So, but from what I read from the Mayflower book, is that's what ticked off King Philip, was that they were purchasing land unfairly. So, I'll say that. And then, but again, it wasn't just the English versus Native Americans. No, the Mohegans were also helping the English. So in all this, there's always self-interest, and the Mohegans and the Powhatans had been enemies long before any English, or not Powhatans, but Massasoit and all them, before any English had even touched a toe on North American continent. Okay, maybe even before the Spanish arrived. All right, if those tribes even existed, who knows? Maybe none of those tribes were existed, and those kind of formed and took out other Native American tribes at that time. Anyway, moving on.
Both geographically and metaphorically, that it's easy to either forget about them or else to view them merely as people to be pitied or reviled. But it's important to know the ways that they resisted colonization, because it reminds us that Native Americans were people who acted in history, not just people who were acted upon by it. And it also reminds us that the history of indigenous people on this landmass isn't separate from American history. It's an essential part of it. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week. Crash Course is produced and directed by Stan Muller.
All right, so yeah, a lot of things that I do not agree with there. And I did not like his statement of saying, oh, well, we're not going to whitewash, basically was saying, we're not going to whitewash history any longer. Now we're going to tell the truth about it. But you miss out some details, so you're not really telling the truth about it, the whole truth and nothing but the truth. So that's my problem is, yes, let's not run over to this side of history, or let's not run over to that side of history. Let's bring it all together. There's a point where there's a middle point here in all these stories, a point where we can say, hey, in this conflict, there's two views. And in these views, there's other views that branch out from it. All right. And there's other actors in it besides just these guys versus these guys, as you want us to assume it is. No, there's way more to it. There's other groups involved. There's some Native Americans that actually enjoy the English here to defeat all of their enemies. And we need to look at that too. We can't just push that aside too. Everything needs to be seen. All right. So if you like this video, please click like and subscribe. And I'm gonna do something different. If you have something that you want me to watch, put it down in the chat. Put the little link in there, and I'll click on it, and I'll do a reaction video to that, and try to keep it about history. And I would love to get a reaction from you about that. So that's it for today, and we will see you again hopefully tomorrow. Now I have more free time to do all these videos. But thanks for watching anyway. Please hit the like button and the subscribe button down below. Thank you and have a great day.